This is Addis Ababa in 1977. A packed military square falls silent as a young officer in olive green uniform steps toward a microphone. In front of him sit 3 glass bottles filled with red liquid. He lifts one into the air, denounces enemies of the revolution, and smashes it to the ground. Then another, then another. The message is unmistakable. Blood will be answered with blood. That officer is Mengistu Haile Mariam. The moment would become one of the most chilling symbols of Ethiopia's Red Terror, a state-led campaign of political violence that left a deep scar on the nation. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, but historians and human rights organizations consistently describe it as one of the most destructive episodes of political repression in modern African history, with hundreds of thousands affected directly or indirectly through executions, disappearances, and famine conditions tied to the conflict environment. What makes Mengistu's rise so significant is not only the scale of violence associated with his rule, but the speed at which he moved from obscurity to absolute power. Born in southwestern Ethiopia in 1937 in the Kifa region during the period of Italian occupation, his earlier life was shaped by instability and shifting authority structures. After the restoration of Emperor Haile Selassie's rule, Mengistu's family relocated, and he eventually found himself within proximity of Ethiopia's military establishment, a pathway that would define his future. As a young man, Mengistu structured within formal education systems and eventually joined the Ethiopian army. Military service became both an escape and an opportunity for advancement. Within the army, he stood out for discipline and ambition, eventually gaining the attention of senior officers. He was later selected for formal officer training at Holita Military Academy, graduating as a second lieutenant in the late 1950s. He also received overseas training, including a period in the United States, an experience frequently noted in historical accounts as formative in his ideological development and his later skepticism of Western political influence. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Ethiopia was under increasing strain. The imperial system under Haile Selassie faced mounting criticism from students, intellectuals, and segments of the military. Structural inequality, land ownership disputes, and reports of famine in regions such as Wolo intensified public dissatisfaction. The 1973 famine in particular became a turning point in public perception, as later reporting revealed delays and suppression of information by authorities, contributing to widespread anger once the scale of suffering became known. Within the armed forces, frustration was also growing. Junior officers faced poor conditions, low pay, and limited advancement opportunities. These tensions culminated in 1974 when coordinated unrest spread across military units. A committee of officers formed to coordinate demands, which later evolved into the organization known as the Derg, meaning Committee in Amharic. Mengistu emerged as one of its most influential members, rapidly gaining prominence within its internal structure. In September 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie was removed from power, ending centuries of imperial rule in Ethiopia. The Derg initially presented itself as a transitional authority aiming to stabilize the country and address systemic inequality. Public reaction was mixed but initially hopeful, as many Ethiopians viewed the fall of the monarchy as the end of entrenched feudal systems. However, internal divisions within the Derg quickly surfaced. Moderates favored gradual reform, while hardliners, including Mengistu, pushed for rapid and uncompromising revolutionary transformation. Tensions escalated sharply in late 1974 when rival factions within the military leadership were eliminated during internal power struggles. One of Mengistu's early mentors, General Aman Andom, was killed during these conflicts, marking a decisive shift towards violent consolidation of power within the Derg. By 1977, Mengistu had effectively emerged as the dominant figure within the military government. Competing leaders had been removed through execution, imprisonment, or political marginalization. The Derg formally abolished the monarchy in 1975 and declared Ethiopia a socialist state aligned with Marxist-Leninist ideology. Nationalization policies were introduced, land redistribution programs were implemented, and the state assumed control over major sectors of the economy. While these policies were framed as efforts to dismantle inequality, their implementation was often abstract and coercive. Administrative capacity was limited, and widespread reconstructing contributed to economic destruction disruption. At the same time, political repression intensified, particularly against opposition groups that criticized the direction of the revolution. The situation escalated dramatically in 1977 with the onset of the Red Terror. This campaign was launched in response to opposition from groups such as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party (EPRP), which had broken with the Derg and engaged in armed resistance. The state responded with sweeping crackdowns targeting suspected dissidents. At a public rally in Addis Ababa, Mengistu delivered a speech that marks the beginning of his campaign's most intensive phase. He declared a hardline stance against counter-revolutionaries and symbolically smashed bottles filled with red liquids, an act widely interpreted as a threat of state violence against opposition forces. Following this period, urban militias and local committees carried out widespread arrests, detentions, and killings. Victims included students, teachers, civil servants, and anyone suspected of opposing the regime. The violence was systematic and widespread. Bodies were often left in public spaces as warnings, and families were sometimes required to pay for the cost of bullets used in execution, a practice documented in survivor testimonies and human rights reports. The exact death toll remains disputed, but estimates range from tens of thousands to several 100,000 over the course of the campaign. At the same time, Ethiopia became involved in the Ogaden War with Somalia in 1977. Somalia invaded Ethiopia's eastern region, aiming to annex Somalia inhabited territories. Initially, Ethiopian forces struggled, but the intervention of the Soviet Union and Cuba shifted the balance. Massive military aid and foreign troop support helped Ethiopia repel the invasion by 1978, strengthening Mengistu's position internationally and domestically. Following this, Ethiopia formally aligned with the Soviet bloc, adopting strict Marxist Leninist policies. The state expanded control over agriculture, industry, and commerce. However, ongoing civil wars in Eritrea, Tigray, and other regions continued to drain resources and destabilize governance. By the mid-1980s, Ethiopia faced one of the worst famines in modern history. Drought, conflict, and policy failures combined to create widespread food shortages. International attention increased dramatically after media coverage revealed the scale of starvation, leading to global humanitarian responses, including major relief campaigns. Despite aid efforts, political instability continued. Rebel groups gained strength throughout the late 1980s, while Soviet support declined due to geopolitical changes. Internal military defeats further weakened the regime's control. In 1991, facing advancing rebel forces and collapsing state authority, Mengistu left Ethiopia and went into exile in Zimbabwe, where he was granted political asylum. His departure marked the end of the Derg regime and the beginning of a transitional government led by opposition conditions. Years later, Ethiopian courts convicted him in absentia of genocide and crimes against humanity based on extensive evidence compiled during post-regime investigations. Despite these convictions, he has remained in Zimbabwe under protection and has never been extradited. In rare interviews, Mengistu has consistently denied personal responsibility for killings, arguing that actions taken under his leadership were part of a broader revolutionary struggle. His statements remain controversial and heavily disputed in historical and legal analysis. Today, Mengistu Haile Mariam remains a polarizing figure in Ethiopian history. To some, he represents a revolutionary who sought to dismantle an unequal system. To others, he remains associated with one of the most violent political campaigns in the country's modern history, a period defined by repression, war, and mass suffering.